So today's film is, of course, Howl's Moving Castle, or better known as part 2 of the Miyazaki Egg trilogy. On a more serious note, today I want to talk a bit about how Miyazaki matures as a director as he gets to Howl's Moving Castle, and how that is reflected in him making a film about adulthood. I'm Adam Doba, and I'm your host for this series. I come from a background in film theory. I worked for 10 years in screenwriting and film translation. I've also done a lot of research into Studio Ghibli, some of which I've shared over the past 6 weeks. And as with all other Miyazaki films, there's a lot of layers to Howl's Moving Castle. There's the fairy tale layer and the archetypal mythology layer, the psychology layer, the social environmental commentary. But the thing is that there's another layer as we go on in time, and that is as Miyazaki matures as a director, his films that were already complex and nuanced to begin with become even more complex and granular in their complexity. And already you get a sense of this in Spirited Away, where there are these entire, like, blink and you'll miss it story arcs, like the character development of the baby, for example. And I realize as I'm looking at this slide that I've made the images look like the baby's head is on top of the conductor's body, which was not the point that I was trying to make. So let's just skip past that real quick. Okay, so similar thing happens in Howl, where the story has such a frantic pace that you can spot new details of significance with every single rewatch. And I've heard someone say in the audience that this is the 12th time they're watching this, which is brilliant. So spot some new things. Again, I've watched this like 30 times before, and I still spot new things in there. It's just so tightly packed. And if you've seen this film a number of times before, I recommend looking at, for example, how Sophie appears different in almost every scene, in almost every shot, or depending on the context, or all the different metamorphoses that the house goes through and how that is reflected in the characters, or even the caricature that is the war that is developing in the background and then suddenly jumps in the forefront in the second half. Also, there's this other tendency that Miyazaki starts doing in his later films, where he starts referring back to his earlier films, but he's not doing it as Easter eggs, so it's not like the pizza truck in all the Pixar films. He's reusing his own symbols deliberately that he's already introduced in different contexts in earlier films, like the umbrella from Totoro, or the binding slime magic from Spirited Away, or even eating as a metaphor that comes back from Spirited Away here in different contexts. What you eat, what you regurgitate, in some cases, what you shouldn't have eaten, and so on. And you can compare and contrast these films based on how Miyazaki uses his own symbology, again, to show you different things. Of course, the great thing about this is if you don't want, you don't have to pay attention to any of these and just go with the story, because it's based so well on the characters who remain the core of the film. You can just go with them and experience the film as their story and get your emotional breakthroughs. So that said, here's a quote from Miyazaki I came across just this week that I think really helps put this film in perspective. He said this at a 2005 press conference at the Venice Film Festival, and he said, "While always saying that I have to or want to make films for children, in reality I often forget about them. That's how I wind up creating films like Porco Rosso or Howl's Moving Castle." And then the interview transcript says, laughs. So it's kind of a cheeky comment. You don't have to take it 100% seriously, but it's still a very interesting thing for him to say, in the sense that this film is about adulthood more than other Miyazaki films. Most of his earlier films have some sort of coming-of-age story going on, whether it's mythological or whether it's really practical, like in Whisper of the Heart. Or you'll grow up through trying to find a solution to the problems that your parents' generation has created, like in Nausicaa or in some extent Castle in the Sky. Or you grow up by fighting for something and having to experience the loss of that something that you're fighting for, like in Mononoke. Or you grow up by finding your place in society and the modern world and making sure you don't turn into a pig when you grow up, like your parents. And after all these coming-of-age stories, we get a film that stars people who are actively trying to avoid being adults for most of the runtime. We have Sophie, who has a lovely outlook on life at the beginning of the film. Just look at that lovely view out the window. Of course, she doesn't want to live her life in the back room making hats, but her experience of life is that it is still better in here than out there, and that's a sentiment I think all the fellow introverts in the audience can empathize with. So when Sophie gets her quote-unquote curse 10 minutes after the film starts, it's actually quite a relief for her, not usually how curses work in films. She's actually really quick to embrace what happens because it means that she can skip this adulting thing entirely and go straight into old age. So she skipped the difficult section and goes to pick her pension up, probably in a cut scene that we don't see. Then we have Howl, who is permanently stuck in adolescence. He loves the power that comes with growing up, but not the responsibilities that come with being an adult. A bit like Spider-Man. Throughout this film, he tries to be everything for everyone while being deadly afraid both of losing control of his power and of not being loved, which is the deeper fear. One of the funniest scenes in the film, which is Howl's emo breakdown, as I like to call it, also reveals something very serious about what his character is really struggling with. And I just learned that Christian Bale is his voice in the American, and I never heard that version, just the Japanese. I'm really happy we're seeing the Japanese. I don't know what Batman's voice is doing with "I'm Howl." This just doesn't work. Anyway, then we have Markl, who we know very little about, but we can kind of deduce that he's the kind of person who had to grow up too quickly for some reason or another. So his actual job is pretending to be an adult. But in the latter half of the film, he also shows his true colors, and we learn that he really needs his belonging and family. And we also have this little guy who always takes first place in cutest ancient fire demon competitions. Calcifer, he's the most ancient mythological thing in the film. He has ties to the Hindu god Agni, who's the god of fire, but also the mouth of the gods that you have to feed in certain rituals. So that kind of goes into the character seat, how that appears in certain parts of the film. But despite his roots, Calcifer himself is actually dealing with the same problem that the other characters are, but in a more metaphorical sense. His question is, what happens if I change? Can I change while remaining the same person I am now? If I change, do I die? And the blink and you'll miss it storyline in the film is the dog with the motley cuff, who has exactly one decision point in the film. It lasts for like 2 seconds, see if you can spot it. It also involves coming out of dependency and making a stand for something, which is why he joins the adventure. There's no other reason for him to suddenly appear next to the other characters, but he gets there in the end, and that is why he also makes a decision, however small. And before I forget, another character that often goes, well, people don't notice that the house is a character in the film, and it's all right. It also changes throughout the film, and the question for the castle is the same as for Calcifer. Do I survive if I keep changing? If I fall apart, which happens multiple times, can I be put together again? And especially because of this latter question, there's an undertone of the castle being Japan, in a similar way how the bathhouse is Japan and Japanese society in Spirited Away. Throughout the film, the castle grows and it changes and it suffers, but it survives through all of the change, and the change is needed for it to grow and to become more of a house that every one of us can live in at the end. By the way, with all the characters dealing with the difference in what I show to the outside world versus how I'm really feeling, there's again this Japanese separation of the outward-facing facade that I put on for society's sake and the inner self, the honne and the tatemae that I mentioned last week regarding Spirited Away. Even the house has its context-dependent outward faces and its inner faces, so the castle itself is very Japanese. So the question is, why are all these people trying to avoid being adults? Well, because of what adults are like. And in this film, adults are greedy, egotistic, they chase money or fame or glory, they fight wars or have power struggles, they manipulate each other. Just look at the examples of the adults Sophie sees around her. Her colleagues who are super shallow and gossip about having a better life but never actually doing anything about it. There's her sister whose entire life revolves around looking pretty and pleasing men in return for attention. And she has her mother whose personality is in constant competition with her own hat for who is more over the top. And then you can look at the men in Sophie's life, lovely people. Just in the first 5 minutes, there's street harassment, catcalling, or mouse calling, more specifically. And every scene with women on their own has men intruding after like 30 seconds. So it's really, if that is what being an adult is like, for Sophie. No wonder you might want to skip it. No wonder you go with the David Bowie lookalike competition runner-up that comes along. Of course, the first prize of the David Bowie lookalike competition goes to Ponyo's dad a couple of years later. And then there's Howl's adults, Soliman, a corrupt mother figure, the king who's an idiot father figure, the witch of the waste who's only in the magic business for greed, and all the other wizards, also lovely chaps, who just did what they were taught to do, and in the result, they lost themselves and their humanity entirely. But the point that the film makes is that while all adults are horrible in their own special way, all these coping mechanisms that our characters use to avoid adulthood do not work. Escapism is not the solution. Whatever magic the characters use to hide the truth is there, it remains there underneath, and if it's not addressed, it will lead to disaster. So they have to figure out how to become adults in a way that they stay true to themselves. Miyazaki wants his characters to live their true lives and find their true spirit. So the path of the characters is to help each other realize they need to be their true selves. They basically have to become each other's therapists, as you can see there. And the story thread this is most expressed with is Howl, who lives in the delusion that he can solve everything with careful maneuvering by being everything for everyone. But as the film progresses, he starts to get drowned up by his many roles. And like some of the other Miyazaki male heroes, his character arc is to learn how to solve things without aggression, and how destruction is also always self-destruction. And of all the male Miyazaki heroes, his learning curve is the steepest, because for most of the film, he actively embraces violence. He says, it's okay, I can solve this whole war thing alone, I don't need help, don't worry about it. I'm not going to be like those other guys. They're the bad guys with magic. I'm the good guy with magic. It's going to be fine. The problem is that it doesn't work. You cannot solve war by winning it, even if you're the best at doing war. Miyazaki's bottom line is always that no war is worth going into. No war is worth fighting. Note again the use of fire in the second half of the film. Fire is good if you use it in moderation as the core energy to heat and to cook and to keep your castle moving. But if you have too much of it, it will be a destructive fire, and it will consume everything that you love. It's a downward spiral that needs to be stopped, and that's why Sophie needs to figure out how she can get to the core of who Howl is underneath that fire, and how she can bring that back. And that leads us to the ending, which I'm not going to spoil. I'm just going to talk about it in general terms. But if you've seen it, you know it's one of the more weirder Miyazaki endings. I've often heard it criticized because as we get to the end of the film, everything is resolved quite suddenly. But if you watch the film close enough and see the internal logic, the entire story was really a setup to that ending. And what Miyazaki does to achieve this is that he combines fairy tale rules with therapy rules. And because he's Miyazaki, this fits together seamlessly. In fairy tales, you find the point of the main plot, and then you go and solve it, and then the kingdom is magically restored. In therapy, you get down to the core of your problem, crack it, get your breakthrough moment, and the deeper the change is, the bigger the ripple effect it has on your life. And that is really what happens at the end of this film. People find their true hearts, literally. What is misplaced is replaced, literally. The violence stops because the need for the thing that was substituted with violence was fulfilled. There's no more need for violence, which in itself is quite a strong commentary on the reasons for war and how to avoid it. But the real statement is how the choice is not between becoming a horrible adult or not growing up at all. The resolution comes when the characters learn to define for themselves what being an adult is, what community is, what family is for them, and what is worth making a stand for and what is making an effort for. And that's the kind of adult that Miyazaki would like you to be, and he's asking very politely, so you should at least try it out. These are the pointers for you today. Closing off, I'd like to thank you for coming to at least one of the 6 screenings. Thank you if you've come to many of them. If you've missed any, you can hop over to my website, which is followthemoonrabbit.com. So that's it. Thanks again for coming. Enjoy the film. See you afterwards for the Q&A.
Hi, this is Adam from Follow the Moon Rabbit, and this was the last of this introductory series to the storytelling behind the Studio Ghibli films. If you missed any of the other videos, you can check them out on this channel. And if you like these videos, do check out the Studio Ghibli Secrets Guide if you haven't yet. It's over on followthemoonrabbit.com. The link is in the description. See you soon.